Hi friends, my name is Ashok and welcome to our channel Ashok IT. In today's video, we are going to talk about Docker commands which are very important for every developer as well as every DevOps engineer. Alright, let's get started. Here, I have divided these Docker commands into multiple parts. Part 1 will talk about the basic Docker commands. In part 2, we'll talk about Docker image related commands. In part 3, we'll discuss Docker containers related commands. In part 4, we'll talk about Docker network related commands. In part 5, Docker volumes related commands. In part 6, Docker compose related commands. In the part 7, Docker swarm commands, and finally conclusion. Alright, let's start. First one, what is a Docker? Docker is a containerization platform. By using this Docker, easily we can develop and we can ship our application into any environment. The main motto of the Docker is develop, build, ship and run. We can run our application inside the container. That container we can execute in any machine without bothering about underlying infrastructure, because Docker will take care of everything that is required to run our application. Docker is a containerization platform. It will manage our application execution on any platform. Alright, so what is the Docker architecture? So to Dockerize any application, first we will write a Docker file. Docker file contains a set of instructions. That means what are the softwares that we need to run our application and where is our source code and where to keep our source code. We need to give instructions to the Docker. All the instructions we will write inside the Docker file. By using the Docker file, we will build a Docker image. Docker image is something like a box which will contain our code and our dependencies required to execute that code. Once we create the Docker image, we can store the Docker image into Docker Hub. Docker Hub is basically a Docker registry where we can store the images. Once we create the image and store in the Docker Hub, you can pull that image at any point of time and you can run the image. Once you run the Docker image, Docker container will be created. Container is a runtime instance of our application. So you can pull that image and you can run that image in any machine. Then container will take care of our application execution. In order to do this process, we are going to execute several commands. So what are those commands? Basic commands, Docker info, which will give you how many Docker images are available and how many Docker containers are available and what is the status of the Docker engine in your machine. Docker version, this command will give you which version of the Docker we have installed in our machine. Docker login, so if you want to connect from our Docker machine to Docker Hub account, then we can use Docker login command. It will ask username and our password. Docker logout, if you want to log out from your Docker Hub account, then we can execute Docker logout command. Then Docker help, if you want to take this, if you want to get the syntax of the Docker commands, then you can take the help from that by using help command. Coming to Docker image commands. What is a Docker image? Docker image is a package which contains our application code plus application dependencies. To create the Docker image, we are going to use a Docker file. Now, what are the commands that we can use to work with the Docker images? Docker images command, which will give you all the Docker images which we have in our machine. Docker RMI image name. RMI is used to delete the particular image from our machine using image name. Docker pull image name. Docker pull command is used to pull the image from the Docker Hub. Docker run image name. Docker run command is used to run the image. When we run the image, Docker container will be created. When we execute the run command, first it will check for the image in our local machine. If it is not available, then it will connect to Docker Hub account, then it will pull the image, then it will run the image. Then Docker run -d container. If you want to run the container in the detached mode, then you can go for Docker run -d -p port mapping and container name, and image name we can give to run that. Then Docker tag command, if you want to tag your Docker image to particular version like V1 and V2 versions, you can use tag command. Docker push command. Push command is used to store the Docker image into Docker registry. Docker history command, if you want to check the history of your Docker image, like when we have copied that, when we have pushed it, all the events we can get of that image using history command. Docker inspect command, if you want to see the low level information of the Docker image, we can go for inspect command. Docker image prune. If you want to delete all unused Docker images, then you can go for Docker image prune command. Have a look at all these commands. Docker images, Docker RMI, Docker pull, Docker run -d with detached mode, Docker tag, Docker push, Docker history, Docker inspect, Docker image prune. Then Docker container commands. As we discussed, Docker container is a runtime instance of our application. Once image is available, we can pull that image and we can run the image, then container will be created. Our application will be executed inside the Docker container. Alright. Docker ps command will give you all the containers which are running in our machine. Docker ps-a. If you want to see all the stopped containers also, we can go for ps-a command. Docker stop container id to stop the running container. Docker start container id. If you want to run the container which is already stopped, then we can use start command. Docker restart container. If you want to restart that container, restart command. Docker rm container id. If you want to remove the stopped container, then we can use docker rm container id. Docker logs container id. If you want to see the logs of a particular container, my application is executing, I want to check the logs of my application, then we can see logs by using this logs command. Docker exec-it with the container id bin/bash. If you want to execute a particular command inside the container, then we can get into the container by using exec-it. For example, my MySQL database is executing inside a container. I want to get into the MySQL container and I want to see what tables are created, what data is inserted. Then to get into the container, we can go for exec command. Then Docker inspect container id. If you want to see the low level information of the container, we can use Docker inspect command. Docker export container. If you want to save the container data into a tar file, we can go for Docker export container command. Then Docker network. Networking is all about communication. When we are running multiple Docker containers, if you want to establish some communication, then we will use a network for those containers. Docker network ls command will give you all the networks which are available in our Docker. By default, Docker will provide some networks. If required, we can also create our own network in the Docker by using Docker network create command. Docker network create with the network name. Docker network rm network name. If you want to remove the network from the Docker, then rm command we can use. Docker network inspect. If you want to see what all the containers are associated to this network, then we can execute this Docker network inspect command. Inspect command basically used to see low level information of our network. Then Docker volumes. So Docker containers are by default stateless, nothing but whenever the Docker container is stopped or removed, we are going to lose the data which got generated by the container. Even if my Docker container got removed, I don't want to lose my data. I want to maintain the data permanently. I want to make my Docker container as stateful container. For example, database. If your database container stopped, I should not lose the data which is already inserted. I want to maintain the data permanently. For that, we will use Docker volumes concept. Volumes basically used for storage. Now, in order to work with these Docker volumes, Docker volume ls command, which will give you all the volumes which are available in the Docker. Docker volume create command, which is used to create a new volume. Docker volume inspect command to see the low level information of that volume. Docker volume rm command to remove the particular volume. Docker system prune volumes. It is used to remove all unused volumes from our Docker machine. Just look at these commands: volume ls, volume create, volume inspect, volume rm, system prune volumes. Next one, Docker compose. Docker compose is a tool which is used to manage multi-container based applications. For example, I want to run my application as one Docker container. I want to run my database as one container. And my application container should connect with the database container for persistence purpose. Instead of creating these containers independently, we can use Docker Compose to manage multi-containerized based applications. Now, in order to work with the Docker Compose, we are going to use several commands. Docker Compose version. It is used to display the version of the Docker Compose. When we install the Docker Compose will not come by default. We need to install the Docker Compose separately in order to start the containers or stop the containers, etc. Docker compose version command will give you which version of the Docker compose installed in our machine. Docker compose -d. Docker compose will use a manifest file called docker compose.yml. In that manifest file, we will write our services details. If you want to start the containers based on the manifest file, we will use docker compose up command. -d is a detached mode to run the containers. Docker compose down command, whatever the containers created by docker compose, if I want to stop and remove them, then docker compose down command we are going to use. Up is used to start the containers, down is used to remove the containers. Docker compose ps, what all the containers created by docker compose which are running, to list down them we will use docker ps command. Docker compose images, what are the images used by our docker compose, we can see them using this command. Docker compose stop, docker compose stop command is used to just stop the containers. Down command will stop and remove the containers also. Stop is just to stop the containers. Compose start, compose start is used to start the containers which are in the stopped state. So remember, up command will start the containers, down command will remove the containers, ps command will list down the containers, stop command will stop the containers, start command will start the containers. Alright, and the last one, Docker Swarm. Docker is a containerization platform which is used to execute our application as a container. If you want to manage multiple containers, if you want to scale up the containers, if you want to scale down the containers, we are going to use orchestration platform. This Docker Swarm is used to manage the life cycle of the containers. Docker Swarm is an orchestration platform. So in order to work with this Docker Swarm, what are the commands? Sudo docker swarm init. It is used to initialize the Docker cluster. Cluster is nothing but group of servers. A master node will be available and worker nodes will be available. Master node will schedule the task to the worker nodes. Worker nodes are going to execute our containers. When we install the Docker Swarm will be part of the Docker software only. You no need to do any additional setup. If you just execute Docker Swarm init, then Docker cluster is going to start to run and manage our containers. Right. So here, if you want to add a worker node to the Docker cluster master node, Docker Swarm join token worker. With this command, we can get the token to join with our Docker Swarm cluster. Once we get the token, if we execute this token in any other machine, that machine will join as a worker node to the master node. First command, swarm init, is used to initialize the Docker cluster. Second command will give the token to join the machines. Third command is used to join with the cluster. We will execute that command along with the token. Then sudo docker service name, and we are going to give the port mapping with the image name. It is used to run our image as a service in the Docker cluster. Then Docker service scale replicas. So for example, 3 containers are running, but I want to run my application in the 6 containers. That is called containers scale up process. We can scale up that by using service scale command. And we can see list of services which are running in the Docker Swarm by using sudo docker service ls command. Similarly, if you want to remove a if you want to remove a service from the Docker cluster, then docker service rm service name. By using this command, we can remove our services which are running in the Docker cluster. If you want to leave the worker, if you want to leave that master, from the cluster, one machine want to leave that. One worker node want to leave from the cluster, then we can go for docker swarm leave command. Just look at these commands: swarm init, swarm join token worker, swarm join token, and start the service, scale the service, list the service, remove the service, and leave from the cluster. Alright, thank you. That's it for today. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends. Until then, bye bye. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.